Hey everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the recorder function in Home Assistant. What the recorder function in Home Assistant does is that's where Home Assistant logs all of its data points when it collects various sensor data or state information from the devices that are attached to it. So by default, when you install Home Assistant, it comes with an SQLite database that gets used to store those data points. The issue I have with SQLite is it's not really designed for a very demanding workload. So while it does a good job at what it's doing with Home Assistant, it captures the data points properly. If you want to be running reports or extracts or a dashboard off an SQLite database, while it can do it, that's not really what it's designed for. In the past, we've gotten around this limitation by manually pushing data points via Node-RED into an Influx database. Influx is a little more user-friendly than SQLite, and Home Assistant actually comes with an Influx plugin that'll allow you to push data points directly there as well. But I think it's worthwhile to take it even a step further and allow the recorder part of Home Assistant to take advantage of a full-featured relational database right off the hop. So having it interact with something like MySQL as it logs data points and state information. And we can forget all these side extracts. We can forget about pushing information to Influx after the fact, and we can forget about having to enable the Influx plugin, because the recorder data is going to be more than robust enough to drive dashboards off of, and that way we have less duplication of data. So what we're going to do today is we're going to actually create a MySQL database to handle all the Home Assistant data, and then we're going to point Home Assistant at it. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our automation server and we're going to actually install MySQL. Now, MySQL is a database a lot of you guys are probably familiar with, or at least have heard of in the past. It was bought by Oracle quite a number of years ago, and some of the open source developers of the MySQL platform forked the code and created a new project called Maria. So MariaDB or Maria database was designed to be fully compatible with MySQL in terms of the commands you use and the SQL that you use to interact with it. So we're going to actually be installing Maria, but you'll see that a lot of the commands that we're using to configure it are MySQL commands, and that's by design. So let's start by downloading the Maria package. So yes to that. Okay, so that's Maria downloaded. We're now going to run a command that will set up the database. So this command, I'll post it in the comments, but basically we're saying MySQL install DB, and we're going to set a default user of MySQL. The base directory for the MySQL binaries is going to be in /usr, and the data directory where the MySQL database data files are going to be stored are in var lib MySQL. So we'll run that. We'll actually run that with sudo, so we have permission to actually write to those directories. Okay, so that was successful. So now we're going to start the database, and we'll do that with systemctl. So sudo systemctl start. So MariaDB is started, and now we're going to do the secure installation. So this is a script that came with MySQL, and is again it's usable with Maria, and it's going to help us secure our instance a little better. So we'll enter a current root password. I haven't set one yet, so none at the moment. And now we're going to set it. Yes. We're going to remove anonymous users. Yes. We're going to disallow root login remotely. This is going to depend on your own comfort level. I would suggest disabling root login remotely, because we're going to be creating a different user that Home Assistant will be using to write to its database. And if you want to do queries against that database from a remote server, you can just use the Home Assistant user that we'll create. So I'm going to say yes to that, but if you don't really care, then you can do what you want. So we're going to remove the test databases. Yep. And we'll reload the privilege tables so that those user removals take effect. Okay, so now that that's done, we're going to log in to MariaDB as our root user. So /u root, enter the password. Okay, so we're in our database instance right now, and if we do a show tables, Sorry, if we do a show databases, you can see that we just have the built-in schemas and the built-in database that come with MySQL for holding configuration. So now we'll add a database that Home Assistant will use to do its recording. Okay. And if we list our databases, now we can see that we have one called HAS. So now we'll create a user that Home Assistant can use to interact with the HAS database. So we'll call that user Home Assistant. And this is how we're going to be doing it. Okay, so we'll say create user. Okay, so we'll say create user home at So basically what we have here is we're creating a user called Home Assistant at wildcard. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to log in as Home Assistant from any node. So although this is on the same machine that Home Assistant is running on, so Home Assistant will usually be logging into it to do the recording as Home Assistant at localhost. Leaving the wildcard there will allow us to also do reporting on this from a different system. Say we want to call it from our Grafana machine or something like that. So that's what that's for. And then the last part is identified by, and then you set a password. So I'm just going to call this password for now, and I'll change it later. And a semicolon to finish it off. Nope, looks like I had a typo in there, so I'm going to fix that. We'll say create user instead, and there we go. So that user's been created. So now all we have left to do is we want to tell MariaDB that the Home Assistant user has all the privileges to read and write to the HAS database. So we're going to do that with a grant statement, and that statement will be grant all on has.star, which means all the tables in that database to Home Assistant at wildcard. And we'll say yes to that, and our query was okay. So now let's do a test login. We'll say exit or quit, and let's do MySQL user Home Assistant -p for our password. We'll enter our password, which is PASSWORD, and we're logged in. Now we'll say use HAS, and we have the privileges to log into HAS. Show tables, and good. So we can at least query the database. So now let's hook Home Assistant up to this database so we can start using it as its recorder. Okay, so we'll navigate to .home assistant. So inside configuration.yaml, the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you don't have a recorder heading set up. So I know I don't, so I'm going to set up a new one right here. And the first parameter that we're going to set up is actually the DB URL. So the way we're going to do this is I've installed MySQL on the same server that Home Assistant is running on. So we're going to point it back to localhost. But as you know, if you've set it up on a different server, this will all still work. You'll just need to point it at the correct host name. So the first thing we're going to type is MySQL as the protocol, and then the username, which in my case is Home Assistant, the password, which is password, and then at localhost, or whichever host is running your MySQL instance, and then the database name. Now you can also add this query string that specifies the character set. Char set equals UTF-8. And I think this is especially important if you're using an alternative character set that's not UTF. So what I'll do now is I will enter that. And the next parameter we want to set up is the retention periods. So what a retention period is the period of time that you want to be able to keep this data for. So what'll happen is you'll set a retention period. Say you set a retention period for 10 days. After data gets aged out, after data becomes 10 days old, the recorder engine will automatically delete that for you. Very handy for keeping an eye on space management and not keeping extraneous data that's not actually going to be helpful in a dashboard or in analytics or anything like that. So I choose to keep a full year of data. You might want more, you might want less, but here's the parameter to set your retention policy. So I'm going to say purge keep days, and I'm going to say 365 for mine, which is 1 year of data. The next section we need to do is an exclude section. So the purpose of this is to give the recorder a list of domains or entities that we don't want included in the data collection. So this might vary from person to person. A lot of it is preference. You could omit this if you want all of your entities to be stored no matter what. But in my case, I don't really use any of the data coming from, the camera domain or the media player domain. I find that to be just a lot of extra noise. I don't need to record a data point every time something that's goes from playing from 10 seconds to 11 seconds to 12 seconds, things like that. And I also don't need to know every time the date and time sensor changes values once per second. So things like that I exclude from the database, but this is all going to be your own preference. So I'm going to quickly just paste in my excludes. And you can see here that I've excluded things like the domains of group, automation, camera, media player, scene, and script. And I'm also purposely excluding the sun entity and the datetime entity. Okay, so we'll save and quit that, and we'll restart Home Assistant. So Home Assistant is successfully restarted. It's now, barring any issues with our configuration, it should be using the MySQL database as its primary location to record state information and data points, but let's go verify that now. We'll log into Maria and make sure that we see the data points we expect to see. So we'll go ahead and we'll use the HAS database. And then we will do a show tables command to see what tables are now in there. Okay, so we can see that we have a table called events, recorder runs, schema changes, and states. So I think the most pertinent tables to us is going to be the states and events table. But let's start by looking at what states has to offer. So we'll say describe states. So these are the columns that are in the states table. We've got state ID, domain, entity ID, state, attributes, event ID, last changed, last updated, created, context ID, and context user ID. So I'm just going to take an example here. First, I want to see all the entity IDs that are stored in the states table. So I'm going to say select distinct entity ID from states. Okay, so here's the distinct entity IDs that I have in states. So I can look at these, find out which one of them I want to know a little more about. So why don't we'll look at sensor phone battery for Brad. That's me. So let's say I want to see the data that's contained in my phone battery sensor. So I want to say select. So we'll look at the columns that are available to us again. So I'll be very interested in the state field and the last updated field. So that's what I'll select for. So I'll say select last updated and state from states where entity ID like sensor.phone battery Brad, and then I will terminate that with a semicolon. So right now we can see, yeah, I'm around 21%. So that was just one example of a query we can do against MySQL. So we can see that Home Assistant's recording data to this database, and that's all available for use by whichever application we want to use to graph it or model it in the future. One of the things I like about Maria over Influx is it's got a lot more powerful SQL query language. So you can actually derive a lot of more interesting statistics out of Maria than you can out of Influx, in my opinion. So although I've recommended Influx in the past, for dashboarding and things like that. It is really easy to get started with, but I think you'll find yourself at some point eventually wanting to have a little more control over the way the data is coming out and the way the data is being formed out of the database. And that's why I decided to release this video about how to store your data in MySQL as well. Anyways, as always, thanks very much for watching. I hope this was helpful. I'm going to put together another video about creating some graphs on a Grafana dashboard, leveraging Maria as the data source. So stay tuned for that. And as always, thanks for watching. See you later.